Before we begin, hit subscribe and turn on notifications, because what you're about to hear isn't fiction, it's the untold truth of La Cosa Nostra, the secret empire that ruled nations from the shadows. Every week, we uncover the hidden stories behind power, blood, and silence, stories history tried to bury. Stay until the end, because once you hear how it all began, you'll never see justice, loyalty, or fear the same way again. Comment your thoughts below and join the community that exposes the truth they don't want you to know. A finales del siglo XIX, cuando el sol se ponía sobre las colinas áridas de Sicilia, el aire no traía tranquilidad, sino miedo. Era una época en la que la justicia no provenía del Estado, sino del acero. Los campesinos, agotados por siglos de opresión feudal, se encontraban atrapados entre el abuso de los terratenientes, la indiferencia del gobierno y la violencia de los bandidos. Sicilia, recién unificada a Italia, era una isla en guerra consigo misma. El ejército del nuevo reino había llegado, pero su ley era tan débil como la tierra seca que no daba fruto. En ese vacío de poder nació algo más fuerte que cualquier institución, una hermandad basada en el silencio, la venganza y la lealtad. La llamaron la Cosa Nostra, nuestra cosa. Dicen que al principio no fue un crimen, sino una necesidad. Los primeros uomini d'onore eran campesinos y jornaleros que decidieron defender lo suyo ante la injusticia. Se organizaban en pequeños grupos, jurando proteger sus tierras, sus familias y su honor. Pero lo que empezó como defensa se transformó pronto en dominio. La justicia se volvió personal, la sangre se pagaba con sangre y la palabra omertà, el código del silencio, se convirtió en ley. Nadie hablaba, nadie traicionaba. En Sicilia, la muerte era preferible a la deshonra. Y así, lentamente, entre los olivares y los callejones de Palermo, la mafia comenzó a respirar. Los historiadores dicen que el primer padrino fue más un símbolo que un hombre. Representaba una figura paternal, un juez en un mundo sin tribunales. Los aldeanos lo buscaban cuando un hijo era asesinado o una hija ultrajada, porque sabían que él haría justicia cuando el Estado no lo haría. Pero esa justicia tenía precio. Los favores eran el inicio de una deuda eterna. Quien pedía ayuda a un hombre de honor quedaba atado a él para siempre. Así se formó la red invisible que cubrió Sicilia, un sistema paralelo de poder que ni el gobierno ni la iglesia podían romper. Las primeras familias mafiosas no se llamaban a sí mismas mafias. Esa palabra, nacida del árabe mayas, lugar de refugio, era al principio un insulto. Pero con el tiempo, los hombres que la encarnaban la convirtieron en una bandera. El orgullo siciliano, mezclado con el resentimiento hacia los invasores, los franceses, los españoles, los italianos del norte, creó una identidad de resistencia. Para ellos, ser parte de la Cosa Nostra no era pertenecer a un grupo criminal, sino ser parte de una hermandad que no respondía a Roma, sino a sus propias leyes. Respetamos a quien nos respeta, decía un viejo proverbio siciliano, pero a quien nos traiciona, lo enterramos bajo las flores. El rito de iniciación era tan sagrado como el bautismo. Se realizaba en habitaciones oscuras, donde los hombres rodeaban una mesa con una imagen de un santo. El nuevo miembro debía pincharse el dedo, dejar caer una gota de sangre sobre la imagen y recitar las palabras: que mi alma arda como este santo si traiciono a la Cosa Nostra. Luego, el fuego consumía la imagen, sellando el pacto eterno. Desde ese momento, el iniciado dejaba de pertenecer a su familia biológica. Su nueva familia era la organización. No había vuelta atrás. La violencia era inevitable. Sicilia, con su historia de dominaciones extranjeras, era un terreno fértil para los códigos de venganza. Los hombres de honor se convirtieron en los nuevos señores, controlando la tierra, los mercados y la política local. Los carabinieri, la policía del Estado, eran vistos como intrusos, enemigos del pueblo. Los asesinatos se resolvían con cuchillos bajo la luna o con disparos en los callejones. Pero a pesar del miedo, muchos respetaban a estos hombres. En sus pueblos, la palabra de un mafioso valía más que una ley firmada por un juez. Con el paso de los años, la Cosa Nostra se volvió más sofisticada. Aprendieron a moverse entre las sombras del poder. Empezaron a infiltrarse en los contratos agrícolas, en los ferrocarriles y en los puertos. El dinero reemplazó al orgullo como motivación, y la hermandad se transformó en negocio. Nombres como Calogero Vicini y Giuseppe Genco Russo emergieron como leyendas. Se les temía y se les reverenciaba. En las aldeas decían que no era posible mover un saco de trigo sin su permiso. La isla entera se convirtió en un tablero de poder, donde cada familia controlaba una región, y la sangre era el precio de mantener el orden. Pero mientras Sicilia vivía bajo el gobierno invisible de la mafia, el resto del mundo apenas empezaba a sospechar su existencia. En 1876, un cónsul británico en Palermo escribió en sus informes que la isla estaba gobernada no por la ley, sino por la intimidación. Nadie se atrevía a hablar. Los testigos desaparecían, los jueces eran amenazados y los políticos preferían callar antes que enfrentarse a los hombres de honor. El silencio era la verdadera fuerza de la Cosa Nostra, un silencio tan profundo que durante casi un siglo su nombre no fue pronunciado en público. Todo cambió con la llegada de la emigración masiva. Miles de sicilianos comenzaron a cruzar el Atlántico, buscando una nueva vida en América, pero con ellos viajaron también los códigos, los juramentos y la estructura secreta de la organización. Lo que había nacido entre las montañas de Corleone y los callejones de Palermo estaba a punto de convertirse en un imperio internacional. La Cosa Nostra cruzaría el océano, y su sombra se extendería sobre las calles de Nueva York, Chicago y Nueva Orleans. Sin embargo, en su origen, la Cosa Nostra fue más que un sindicato del crimen. Fue una respuesta brutal al abandono, una justicia nacida del dolor y la pobreza. Cada muerte, cada traición, cada pacto de sangre tenía detrás una historia de humillación y orgullo. La mafia no nació del mal puro, sino del vacío del Estado, del deseo de los hombres de tener control sobre su destino. Y aunque el mundo la conocería como una organización de terror, en los ojos de quienes la fundaron fue una forma de sobrevivir. Cuando los últimos rayos del sol se escondían sobre los tejados de Sicilia, los hombres de honor se reunían en silencio, fumando, observando el horizonte. Sabían que habían creado algo que ningún ejército podría destruir. En la penumbra de una isla olvidada, entre el humo del vino y la pólvora, nacía nuestra cosa. La historia apenas comenzaba. By the late 19th century, when the sun sank behind the dry Sicilian hills, the air carried not peace but fear. The island was bleeding from centuries of foreign rule. Arabs, Spaniards, French, and now the newly unified Italian kingdom. The promises of freedom that came with unification had turned into betrayal. The peasants who worked the fields of Palermo and Corleone were still at the mercy of brutal landlords and corrupt officials. Justice existed only for the rich. For everyone else, there was only silence and the knife. It was in this climate of despair and rebellion that La Cosa Nostra, our thing, was born. At first, it wasn't a criminal empire. It was a code of survival. Groups of men, known as uomini d'onore, men of honor, rose to defend their land and their people when the state failed them. They weren't seen as villains, but as protectors. When a man's son was killed, or his land was stolen, he didn't go to the police. he went to the local capo. Justice in Sicily was no longer written in laws, but in blood. But what began as protection soon turned into power. The men who enforced justice started to realize that fear could rule just as effectively as the law. Loyalty became currency. Silence became sacred. The code of omertà, the vow never to speak to the authorities, was enforced with death. Betrayal wasn't forgiven. It was erased, and the island learned to whisper its secrets only among those who shared the same blood oath. Sicily at that time was a paradox, an island with beauty as haunting as its violence. Lemon groves and vineyards lay next to burned-out villages. The government in Rome saw Sicily as a problem to be contained, not a people to be understood. That neglect created a vacuum, and in that vacuum the first shadow of La Cosa Nostra took shape. It wasn't one family at first, but many, small clans bound by the same rules: loyalty to one another, respect for silence, and vengeance for betrayal. The initiation into this secret brotherhood was more sacred than any baptism. In a dimly lit room, surrounded by men who had already proven themselves through loyalty and blood, the new recruit would be tested. His finger was pricked, and a drop of his blood fell upon a saint's image. The image was then set on fire as the initiate swore, "May my soul burn as this saint burns if I ever betray La Cosa Nostra." When the flames consumed the saint, the man's old life was gone. His family, his past, his conscience, all replaced by the brotherhood. From that night forward, his loyalty belonged to our thing. The first true Mafia bosses weren't the cigar-smoking gangsters of later decades. They were men of the soil. Figures like Calogero Vizzini and Giuseppe Genco Russo ruled the Sicilian countryside with an iron hand wrapped in silk. They controlled who worked, who married, who lived, and who died. Even the church, powerful as it was, often turned a blind eye. Priests gave blessings to men who carried revolvers under their coats, and when the government sent the Carabinieri, Italy's national police, to restore order, entire towns turned silent. No one saw anything. No one heard anything. No one talked. By the 1870s, the Mafia had become more than a collection of thugs. It was a system, a parallel state. Through fear, favors, and blood, they controlled land disputes, business contracts, and even elections. The Mafia's rule was invisible but absolute, and because it was invisible, it was invincible. For the average Sicilian, there was no escape. To survive, one had to choose, join the silence, or be buried by it. Foreign observers began to take notice. In 1876, the British consul in Palermo wrote that the island is governed not by law, but by intimidation. It was the first written acknowledgement of what Sicilians had known for decades, that the true rulers of the island did not sit in government offices, but in smoky back rooms, surrounded by men whose loyalty was bound by fear. The Mafia was not simply a criminal group, it was the shadow of Sicily's soul. The word Mafia itself was born from insult. Some claim it comes from the Arabic mahjas, meaning refuge or protection. Others say it emerged from the Sicilian word mafioso, meaning proud, defiant, untouchable. Whatever its root, the word came to define an identity. To be mafioso was not to be a criminal, it was to be powerful, respected, feared, a man who answered to no one but his own code. "We respect those who respect us," the saying went, "but whoever betrays us dies." As the decades passed, the Mafia's reach expanded beyond vengeance and land disputes. They learned to move like ghosts between legality and crime. They infiltrated trade unions, smuggling networks, and government contracts. They became indispensable intermediaries in every transaction that mattered, and as their influence grew, so did their wealth and their ambition. Sicily, the island once known for poets and peasants, was now a kingdom of silence ruled by invisible kings. The authorities in Rome tried to crush them with military force, but the Mafia had already rooted itself deep within the culture. They were not an organization that could be dissolved by arrests. They were part of the social fabric. Mothers prayed for their sons to become men of honor, not policemen. The true tragedy of La Cosa Nostra's birth was not that it existed, but that it was needed. Then came the Great Migration. Between the 1880s and 1920s, millions of Italians, especially Sicilians, left their homeland for the promise of America. They brought their traditions, their faith, and their silence. Among them were the first mafiosi, carrying the codes and rituals of their brotherhood across the Atlantic. In the chaos of New York, New Orleans, and Chicago, they would rebuild what they had left behind, a shadow society bound by loyalty and blood. But before it crossed the ocean, La Cosa Nostra had already proven one thing: it could outlast governments, revolutions, and generations. It was not just a criminal system. It was a way of life. Born out of poverty, baptized in blood, and protected by silence, it would soon become one of the most powerful criminal organizations in human history. In the fading light of a Sicilian evening, the first uomini d'onore gathered, their faces lit by flickering candles, their words carried softly in dialect. "We have no faith in the law," one of them said, "so we make our own." And as the night deepened over the island, La Cosa Nostra, our thing, was born. The journey began not with a gun, but with hunger. Between the late 1800s and the early 1900s, hundreds of thousands of Sicilians boarded rusted ships, bound for a land they only knew from rumor. L'America, the country where streets were said to be paved with gold. In reality, they were paved with blood, sweat, and broken dreams. The men and women who arrived at Ellis Island came seeking survival, carrying little more than faith, superstition, and the ancient codes of their homeland. Hidden among them were the seeds of an empire, the first uomini d'onore who would transplant the dark roots of La Cosa Nostra into American soil. The earliest traces of the Mafia in America can be found not in New York, but in the humid streets of New Orleans. By the 1880s, the city had become a major hub for Italian immigrants, dock workers, grocers, fruit merchants, many of them from Palermo and Corleone. Within their tightly knit communities, old loyalties and rivalries followed them across the sea. Soon, whispers spread through the docks of a secret brotherhood, men who could protect your business or destroy it. They controlled the flow of citrus fruit, gambling dens, and protection rackets. Locals began calling them the Black Hand, a name born from the letters they sent to extort their victims, marked with a crude drawing of a hand dipped in ink, a promise of death if demands weren't met. In 1890, their presence exploded into public view. New Orleans Police Chief David Hennessy was assassinated one rainy night as he walked home. Before dying, he reportedly whispered, "The Dagos did it." Dozens of Sicilian immigrants were arrested, accused of conspiring in his murder, but the trial fell apart. Witnesses vanished, evidence evaporated, and jurors were bribed or threatened. When the suspects were acquitted, a mob of enraged citizens stormed the prison, dragging 11 Italians into the street and lynching them. It was one of the largest mass lynchings in American history, and it marked the first time Americans publicly confronted the terrifying idea that the Sicilian Mafia had crossed the ocean. Yet, far from destroying it, that act of vengeance drove it deeper underground. While the South recoiled from the scandal, New York was becoming its new capital. In the crowded slums of Lower Manhattan, Italian immigrants built a world of their own, a mosaic of dialects, churches, and neighborhoods ruled by invisible hands. Among the bustling pushcarts of Mulberry Street, men like Giuseppe Morello, known as the Clutch Hand, rose to power. Morello and his associates controlled counterfeiting rings, extortion rackets, and black market goods. His organization, centered in the East Harlem neighborhood, is widely considered the first true mafia family in America. Their influence spread through the tenements like wildfire, a mix of fear, loyalty, and opportunity. Morello's crew worked closely with another infamous figure, Ignazio Lupo, known as Lupo the Wolf. Together, they built a criminal network that extended from New York to Chicago, smuggling, forging, and murdering anyone who stood in their way. The authorities struggled to understand them. Their enemies vanished without a trace. Their witnesses refused to speak. When the police raided one of their hideouts, they found coded ledgers and documents written in a strange Sicilian dialect, incomprehensible to anyone outside the Brotherhood. For the first time, the American government realized it was dealing with something much older, much darker, and much more organized than a street gang. By the early 1900s, La Cosa Nostra had embedded itself into the very fabric of immigrant life. They offered protection when no one else would, jobs when honest work was scarce, and justice when the courts ignored the poor. To the struggling Italian worker, the padrino, the godfather, was a figure of power and pride, someone who understood the rules of survival in a foreign land. But behind this mask of benevolence lay an iron system of extortion. Every shopkeeper, every fruit vendor, every laborer paid their dues. Those who didn't soon regretted it. As America modernized, so did the Mafia. They abandoned the crude brutality of the Black Hand for the sophistication of organized crime. The families began to form, structured hierarchies modeled after the Sicilian system. Each family had its boss, underboss, capo regime, and soldiers. They met in secret, held councils, and enforced their laws through blood. And unlike the street gangs of the Irish or the Jews, the Italians had something no one else possessed: centuries of silence. Then came Prohibition, America's great moral experiment, and the Mafia's golden opportunity. When the United States banned alcohol in 1920, the underworld exploded. Speakeasies, bootlegging, and smuggling became billion-dollar enterprises overnight. The Mafia, already expert in secrecy, stepped in to fill the demand. The old Sicilian networks, combined with new alliances, built an empire of crime that stretched from the docks of New York to the alleys of Chicago. It was during this time that names like Al Capone, Johnny Torrio, Frank Costello, and Lucky Luciano became legends. Luciano, in particular, understood something that no one else did, that the future of La Cosa Nostra depended on organization. He eliminated the old feuds between Sicilian families and brought order to chaos. In 1931, after a bloody internal conflict known as the Castellamarese War, Luciano established the Commission, a governing body of mafia families that divided territories, settled disputes, and enforced discipline. What had begun as small Sicilian brotherhoods had now evolved into a multinational criminal corporation. But behind this rise, there was always the shadow of Sicily, the land that had given birth to the code, the silence, the blood oath. The American Mafia never forgot its roots. Its rituals, its language, even its methods of initiation remained the same. A drop of blood, a burning saint, a vow of eternal loyalty. The difference was scale. Where Sicily had villages, America had cities. Where Sicily had landowners, America had politicians, bankers, and businessmen. Corruption moved upward until even the most respectable offices in New York and Chicago whispered the same word in fear: Mafia. By the time World War II erupted, La Cosa Nostra had fully integrated into American life. They ran docks that shipped war supplies, controlled unions that built the nation, and financed enterprises that reached the highest levels of power. In 1943, U.S. naval intelligence even turned to the Mafia for help securing New York's harbors from Nazi sabotage, a deal that forever blurred the line between patriotism and crime. When the war ended, the Mafia was stronger than ever, its roots buried in both sides of the law. The ocean that had once separated the old world from the new had failed to contain the beast. The Mafia had adapted, evolved, and embedded itself in the American dream. It no longer needed the hills of Sicily. It had skyscrapers, shipping companies, and city halls. The men of honor had become kings of a new empire, one that would soon face its most dangerous enemy, exposure. The silence that had protected La Cosa Nostra for generations was beginning to crack, and as the FBI's eyes turned toward the shadows, the Mafia prepared for war, not in Sicily, but in the heart of the United States. It began with a single law, the 18th Amendment, but it ignited an era of blood, greed, and power unlike anything America had ever seen. On January 17, 1920, the United States officially banned the manufacture, sale, and transport of alcohol. Politicians called it a noble experiment. The underworld called it opportunity. Almost overnight, the thirst of a nation became the engine of organized crime. People didn't stop drinking. They simply started paying for their drinks in cash, secrecy, and blood. From New York to Chicago, from Detroit to Kansas City, hidden bars known as speakeasies opened in basements, warehouses, and even churches. Police were outnumbered, judges were bribed, and in the shadows, a new empire was forming, one that would turn Sicilian gangs into criminal dynasties. At the heart of this empire stood a man named Charles "Lucky" Luciano, a Sicilian immigrant who understood better than anyone that prohibition was not about liquor, it was about control. Born in Palermo and raised in New York's Lower East Side, Luciano had seen poverty, violence, and corruption since childhood. He began as a street hustler, but quickly learned the value of alliances. While old-school mafia bosses clung to Sicilian purity and tradition, Luciano reached across ethnic lines. He partnered with Jewish gangsters like Meyer Lansky and Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, Irish mobsters like Oni Madden, and even corrupt politicians. He saw the future, organized crime as a business, not a vendetta. Meanwhile, in Chicago, another name was becoming legend: Alphonse "Al" Capone. A Brooklyn-born son of Italian immigrants, Capone moved west under the wing of Johnny Torrio, a master strategist who saw the city as a gold mine. Chicago was the perfect breeding ground for organized crime, corrupt officials, violent streets, and endless demand for illegal liquor. When Torrio retired after an assassination attempt in 1925, Capone took over his empire and transformed it into a war machine. Capone controlled everything from breweries to brothels. His men hijacked shipments, murdered rivals, and bribed police with stacks of cash thicker than Bibles. He paid his hitmen weekly salaries, gave bonuses for successful jobs, and operated his empire like a corporation. But power came at a price. As profits soared, so did the body count. Between 1925 and 1929, Chicago averaged more than 500 gang-related murders. And while Capone ruled with charm and cruelty, his enemies plotted revenge. The most infamous moment came on February 14, 1929, the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. In a cold Chicago garage, 7 men from a rival gang led by George "Bugs" Moran were lined up against a brick wall and executed by gunmen dressed as police officers. The killers used Tommy guns, shredding the victims in seconds. The scene shocked America. Newspapers printed gruesome photos across the front pages, and for the first time, the public realized the Mafia was not just a rumor. It was a system of power, money, and death. While Capone's brutality made headlines, Luciano's quiet intelligence built foundations. In New York, he watched as old Sicilian bosses like Giuseppe "Joe the Boss" Masseria and Salvatore Maranzano fought for dominance in what became known as the Castellamarese War. Streets ran red with the blood of men who refused to adapt. Luciano, tired of the chaos, decided to end it. He betrayed both sides, orchestrating Masseria's assassination in 1931, followed months later by Maranzano's. The old guard was gone. In their place, Luciano created the Commission, a national governing body of the American Mafia. It was a revolutionary idea. 5 major families, each controlling their territories, working together like shareholders of a corporation. There would be no more boss of bosses. Instead, they would rule collectively, unless someone broke the rules. Under Luciano's leadership, the Mafia became truly modern. They diversified their operations, bootlegging, gambling, narcotics, and unions. They laundered money through legitimate businesses and used intimidation to control industries from construction to shipping. The profits were staggering. During Prohibition, some families made the equivalent of hundreds of millions of dollars a year, but what made the system invincible was not just money, it was silence. The Omerta Code still ruled. The public saw charming businessmen, only the streets knew the truth. The Mafia's influence seeped into every corner of society. Politicians accepted campaign donations from men with blood on their hands. Police captains were bought. Judges looked the other way. And while the country suffered through the Great Depression, Mafia bosses dined in luxury hotels and drove bulletproof Cadillacs. In many immigrant neighborhoods, they were viewed as Robin Hood figures, men who gave jobs, protection, and respect to the poor when the government offered nothing. But their generosity always came with a price: loyalty, obedience, and the occasional disappearance. By the late 1920s, rivalries among bootlegging empires turned American cities into war zones. In Detroit, the Purple Gang, led by Jewish mobsters, fought bloody wars with Italian families. In New York, Irish gangs clashed with the Five Families over control of docks and warehouses. And in Chicago, Capone's empire began to crumble under federal scrutiny. The U.S. government, embarrassed by his power, finally found a way to bring him down. Not for murder or racketeering, but for tax evasion. In 1931, Capone was sentenced to 11 years in prison. His reign of terror was over, but his legend would never die. Ironically, that same year, Luciano was at his peak. He had survived war, betrayal, and countless assassination attempts. He had turned scattered gangs into a disciplined network that spanned the country. Through the commission, he enforced peace among families, a balance maintained not by law, but by fear. For every handshake that sealed a deal, there was a gun behind the curtain to enforce it. Under his vision, the Mafia ceased to be a chaotic gang of killers. It became a corporation of crime. Prohibition ended in 1933, but by then, the Mafia no longer needed alcohol to thrive. It had already found power in unions, construction, narcotics, and gambling. The government had handed them their first fortune, and they used it to build an empire. Blood had become gold, and once gold entered the veins of La Cosa Nostra, it would never stop flowing. By the 1940s, the Mafia controlled so much of America's underground economy that even the FBI could barely trace its influence. Luciano's empire had changed the underworld forever, turning the lessons of Sicily into the foundation of American organized crime. And yet, beneath the wealth, beneath the tailored suits and million-dollar smiles, the same code remained: silence, loyalty, and death for those who betrayed it. The world would remember Prohibition as a failed experiment. But for La Cosa Nostra, it was a baptism of power, the moment when a brotherhood born in the dirt of Sicily became an empire that ruled the streets of America. By the early 1930s, the Mafia in America had become an empire, rich, disciplined, and dangerous. But beneath the suits, cigars, and polished manners, a storm was brewing. The Sicilian blood that ran through the veins of La Cosa Nostra was loyal only to power. And when too many men reached for the same crown, war became inevitable. What followed would be one of the bloodiest internal conflicts in the history of organized crime. A war not between cops and gangsters, but between gangsters themselves. The streets of New York became the battlefield of the Castellamarese War, named after the small Sicilian town of Castellammare del Golfo, birthplace of many of the combatants. The two titans of the conflict were Giuseppe "Joe the Boss" Masseria and Salvatore Maranzano, men of pride, tradition, and cruelty. Both had risen from the old Sicilian order, believing themselves destined to rule all Italian organized crime in America. But there was only room for one king. Mafia controlled much of Manhattan. His men extorted businesses, ran illegal gambling rings, and demanded loyalty through terror. He was cunning, paranoid, and greedy, a boss who saw the Mafia as his personal kingdom. Maranzano, on the other hand, was more calculated, almost academic in his approach. A devout believer in the ancient Roman hierarchies, he imagined himself as a Caesar of the underworld, ready to impose discipline and structure. Between these two men, peace was impossible. The war began in 1929, triggered by a mix of ambition and betrayal. Soldiers who once drank together now hunted each other through the alleys of Little Italy. Drive-by shootings, ambushes, and disappearances became daily events. Innocent bystanders died in crossfire. Restaurants, barbershops, and tenement hallways became killing grounds. The newspapers started to whisper about the Mafia war. But the truth was even darker. This was a civil war, fought with silence and blood among men who had once sworn brotherhood. Amid the chaos, one figure quietly observed, learning, waiting, Charles "Lucky" Luciano. He had worked under Joe Mafia, but never worshipped him. Luciano saw what the old men could not, that the future of the Mafia could not depend on Sicilian pride or old vendettas. The new America demanded a new kind of leadership. The war between Mafia and Maranzano, in his eyes, was not just a battle for power. It was a struggle between the past and the future. Luciano had been raised in the gutters of New York, but had the vision of a businessman. He understood that loyalty without reason was suicide, and that blood spilled without profit was wasted. He wanted peace, but not under either of the two bosses. He wanted order, modernity, and efficiency. And so, as the war dragged into its third year, Luciano made a decision that would change the Mafia forever. He would end the war by ending both of its leaders. The first to fall was Joe Mafia. On April 15, 1931, Luciano invited his boss to lunch at a small Coney Island restaurant called Nuova Villa Tamaro. They ate seafood, played cards, and drank wine. When Luciano excused himself to the bathroom, 4 of his associates, Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, Vito Genovese, Albert Anastasia, and Joe Adonis, entered the room and opened fire. Mafia slumped over the table, his hand still clutching an ace of spades. The newspapers called it the death of the boss. Luciano called it progress. With Mafia gone, Maranzano emerged as the uncontested ruler. He crowned himself Capo di tutti capi, the boss of all bosses, and began to reorganize the Mafia according to strict Roman lines. He divided New York into 5 families, each with its own hierarchy of boss, underboss, and captains. He also began taxing other gangs, demanding tributes, and ordering hits on anyone who challenged his authority. But his arrogance was his undoing. He saw Luciano's vision of a modern, multi-ethnic organization as heresy, and he planned to eliminate him. Luciano, however, was already one step ahead. He learned of Maranzano's plans through his Jewish allies, Lansky and Siegel, and decided to strike first. On September 10, 1931, 5 men posing as government agents walked into Maranzano's office in Manhattan. They flashed badges, announced a raid, and within seconds pulled out knives and guns. Maranzano was stabbed and shot repeatedly, dying on the floor of his own empire. His reign had lasted only a few months. The age of the old dons was over. Luciano wasted no time in reshaping the Mafia in his image. He abolished the title of Boss of Bosses and created the Commission, a council of the most powerful families in the country. The Gambino, Lucchese, Genovese, Bonanno, and Colombo families. Each boss had a seat at the table. Decisions would be made collectively, and disputes settled through negotiation rather than open war. It was the most radical transformation in the history of organized crime, turning chaos into structure, blood into governance. Yet even within this new order, betrayal remained the heartbeat of the Mafia. Alliances shifted like sand. Friends one day became enemies the next. Luciano himself would later fall victim to the same game he had mastered, arrested and imprisoned in 1936 through a series of betrayals and political deals. His successors would rise and fall in the same rhythm: power, paranoia, downfall. The Castellammarese War left scars that never healed. More than 60 men had died, but the psychological toll was far deeper. Every surviving boss learned a cruel lesson. In the Mafia, loyalty was an illusion, and trust was a weapon waiting to be turned against you. Even within the five families, internal bloodletting continued. Underbosses plotted against bosses. Capo regimes secretly aligned with rivals. The Mafia's new structure brought peace on the surface, but beneath it, the fires of betrayal still burned. The legacy of this war shaped everything that came after. It defined how La Cosa Nostra would operate for the next 50 years, silent, organized, corporate, but always ruled by fear. Every oath of brotherhood carried the echo of those early betrayals. Every dinner among bosses was haunted by the ghost of Masseria's last meal. And though Luciano's new system brought stability, it also institutionalized treachery. Violence became selective, strategic, no longer chaos, but calculation. The Mafia had learned how to kill efficiently, and that efficiency would soon make it unstoppable. The war within had ended, but its lesson was eternal. In La Cosa Nostra, there were no friends, only alliances waiting to collapse. When the blood dried on the streets of New York, the Mafia stood stronger than ever, reborn from its own violence. The old world of vendetta had died with Maranzano. What emerged in its place was something far more dangerous, a syndicate that understood power not as passion, but as business. The men who survived the war would go on to rule America's underworld, until their own betrayals wrote the next chapter of blood. By the mid-20th century, La Cosa Nostra had become an invisible empire. It no longer needed to parade its power through bullets in the streets. Its control was quieter, deeper, woven into the very fabric of American society. The Mafia's true brilliance was not in violence, but in invisibility. While politicians shook hands at banquets and businessmen signed million-dollar contracts, the men of honor watched from the shadows, pulling strings that no one could see. The Second World War had changed everything. When America joined the fight in 1941, the Mafia found a new way to prove its usefulness. Luciano, imprisoned for running a vast prostitution racket, struck a secret deal with U.S. naval intelligence. Through his connections on the docks of New York, he ensured the protection of American ships from Nazi sabotage. In return, his prison sentence was quietly reduced, and after the war, he was deported to Italy, a free man and a legend. That deal, the state joining hands with the underworld, marked the beginning of a complicated, silent war. For decades, the Mafia and the US government would circle each other like wolves, sometimes fighting, sometimes feeding from the same carcass. When the soldiers came home from Europe, the country entered a new age of wealth and optimism. Skyscrapers rose, suburbs sprawled, and televisions flickered in living rooms across the nation. But beneath that shiny post-war dream, the Mafia grew richer than ever. Construction, shipping, labor unions, garbage collection, every industry with cash and corruption became their playground. They controlled the docks through the International Longshoremen's Association, the trucking business through Teamsters Union, and even the meat and garment industries through extortion and protection fees. To the public, they were ghosts. To the FBI, they were a rumor that refused to die. That rumor became reality in 1957 in a small, quiet town in upstate New York called Appalachian. On November 14th, dozens of luxury cars rolled into the estate of Joseph Barbara, a wealthy soda bottler and mob associate. The meeting was meant to be discreet. The heads of Mafia families from across the country had gathered to discuss business, gambling territories, narcotics distribution, and how to manage growing tension between East Coast and Midwest operations. But local police, suspicious of so many expensive cars in one rural driveway, surrounded the property. When the officers moved in, chaos erupted. Dozens of mobsters fled through the woods in their suits and polished shoes, tossing guns and cash as they ran. Over 60 men were detained, many of them high-ranking Mafia leaders. The Appalachian meeting was supposed to be secret. Instead, it became the smoking gun that proved La Cosa Nostra existed. For the first time, the American press printed the word Mafia in bold headlines. The FBI under J. Edgar Hoover could no longer deny what it had long ignored. For years, Hoover had downplayed organized crime, preferring to focus on communism and political threats. But now, with photos of mobsters sprinting through cornfields, the truth was undeniable. There was an invisible government operating within the United States. In the years that followed, the government began to strike back, but cautiously. The Mafia's power extended into politics, law enforcement, and business. They had judges on their payroll, senators in their pockets, and police chiefs under their influence. Taking them down meant tearing into America's own institutions. Yet, slowly, cracks began to form. The first real break in the Mafia's armor came from within. In 1963, a soldier named Joseph Valachi, serving time in prison for murder, decided to talk. He became the first made man to publicly break the code of omertà. Before a stunned Senate committee, Valachi described the secret structure of La Cosa Nostra, its rituals, its families, its bosses. He named names: Carlo Gambino, Vito Genovese, Joseph Bonanno. He explained the blood oath, the rules, the punishments. The senators listened in disbelief as he described how every major city had its own family and how all were connected through the commission. It was the first time the American public heard the Mafia described not as scattered gangs, but as a national syndicate, a shadow government built on fear and silence. Valachi's testimony changed everything. The FBI launched new task forces dedicated to organized crime, planting informants, wiretapping phones, and infiltrating unions. But the Mafia adapted. They had survived wars, betrayals, and governments before. They buried themselves deeper in legitimate industries, expanded into Las Vegas casinos, and built alliances with Cuban traffickers to smuggle narcotics. The more the state attacked, the more La Cosa Nostra evolved. The 1960s and 1970s were years of paradox. The FBI was finally taking the Mafia seriously, but public fascination with gangsters had reached new heights. Hollywood romanticized the underworld with films like The Godfather, transforming real-life killers into tragic heroes. For many Americans, the Mafia became part of the cultural myth, men of loyalty, family, and honor. The irony was painful. While movies glorified their codes, real families in New York and Chicago lived under their terror. Behind the glamour, the war between the Mafia and the state raged quietly. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, now near the end of his career, unleashed surveillance operations that reached deep into the five families. Agents spent years tailing suspects, recording conversations in social clubs, and mapping family hierarchies. But progress was slow. For every informant they recruited, 2 others disappeared. Evidence was destroyed, witnesses silenced, jurors bought. The Mafia didn't fear bullets anymore, it feared betrayal. The true turning point came with the creation of the RICO Act in 1970, the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. It gave prosecutors the power to target entire criminal enterprises rather than individual crimes. For the first time, the government could hold Mafia bosses responsible for the actions of their soldiers. The law was a time bomb, but it would take a decade before it exploded. Meanwhile, the Mafia continued to thrive in silence. In Las Vegas, they skimmed millions from casinos through front companies and corrupt unions. In New York, they controlled the construction boom, Every skyscraper that rose in Manhattan paid its unseen tax to the five families. In Hollywood, they financed films and laundered profits. And in Washington, lobbyists whispered promises while campaign envelopes slid across tables. The Mafia was no longer the shadow of America. It was its reflection, but no empire lasts forever. By the 1980s, the FBI had built its case. Using wiretaps, undercover agents, and flipped soldiers, they launched Operation Donnie Brasco and the Commission trial. In 1986, 8 of the most powerful Mafia bosses, including Anthony "Tony Ducks" Corallo, Carmine Persico, and Anthony "Fat Tony" Salerno, were convicted under RICO. It was the government's greatest victory in the silent war. The Commission, the heart of La Cosa Nostra's power, had been shattered. And yet, even in defeat, the Mafia refused to vanish. Its leaders were imprisoned, but its networks endured. Money still flowed, silence still ruled, and fear still kept mouths closed. The war between La Cosa Nostra and the state had never truly been about bullets or trials. It was about control. Who would rule the invisible territory of power that lay between law and chaos? The Mafia's silence was its greatest weapon, but it was also its curse. Because in the end, every empire built on secrecy dies from within, not with a bang, but with a whisper. The silent war was far from over. It was only changing shape. And in the coming years, blood would once again return to the streets, this time in the land where it all began. By the 1980s, the empire that had once ruled from the shadows of America's cities began to crack under the weight of its own silence. The streets that had once whispered the names of Luciano, Gambino, and Genovese now echoed with the sound of sirens, courtroom doors, and prison gates. The government had learned the language of organized crime, and now it was speaking it fluently. But what no one realized at the time was that La Cosa Nostra would not die with its bosses. It would simply change shape, shedding blood for suits, bullets for influence, and becoming something even harder to destroy. A ghost that lived in plain sight. The fall began quietly, as all things in the Mafia did. In 1981, FBI agent Joseph Pistone, better known by his undercover name Donnie Brasco, had spent 6 years infiltrating the Bonanno family. Living as a jewel thief, he gained the trust of capos and soldiers, collecting evidence that would lead to more than 100 convictions. When the operation was revealed, the Mafia was humiliated. They had always believed they could smell betrayal, but now the scent of fear spread faster than gunpowder. Every handshake, every meeting, every loyal face became a question mark. The omerta, the sacred code of silence, was beginning to rot from within. Then came the Commission trial of 1986, the most devastating blow the Mafia had ever suffered. Using the RICO Act, prosecutors linked bosses to murders, extortion, and racketeering schemes across multiple families. The evidence came not from witnesses, but from the Mafia's own words. Secret recordings from bugged social clubs, wiretapped payphones, and hidden microphones. For the first time in history, the very walls of their sanctuaries betrayed them. The verdict was brutal. 8 of the most powerful bosses in New York were sentenced to a combined 100 years in prison. The Commission, the very heart of La Cosa Nostra's power, was dismantled. It was the end of an era. But the Mafia had always been an organism of survival. While the public celebrated its downfall, new generations quietly adapted. They shifted away from the bloody street wars that had drawn too much attention and focused instead on invisible industries: stock market manipulation, insurance fraud, real estate, waste management, and the infiltration of politics. Their new leaders wore suits instead of leather jackets. They drove Mercedes instead of Cadillacs, and they learned that the best crime was the one that looked like business. Across the ocean, in Sicily, a different kind of war was raging. The Italian branch of La Cosa Nostra, known simply as Cosa Nostra, had declared open defiance against the state. The 1980s saw a brutal campaign of assassinations against judges, journalists, and politicians who dared to challenge their reign. The bloodiest moment came in 1992, when two anti-mafia magistrates, Giovanni Falcone and Paolo Borsellino, were murdered in coordinated bomb attacks. The first explosion near Capaci tore Falcone's car apart on a highway, killing him, his wife, and his bodyguards. 2 months later, Borsellino was killed by a car bomb outside his mother's home in Palermo. The message was clear: even justice could bleed. But their deaths backfired. Millions of Italians flooded the streets, waving banners that read, "La Mafia uccide, il silenzio pure." The Mafia kills, but silence kills too. For the first time, the Sicilian people broke the omertà. They named names, they testified, they pointed fingers at the bosses who had terrorized them for generations. The arrests that followed, including that of Salvatore Toto Riina, the most feared mafia boss in modern history, marked the beginning of the end for the Sicilian mafia's reign of terror. Yet even as its leaders fell, its shadow endured. In America, the story was no less haunting. The mafia's golden age of family loyalty had given way to paranoia and decay. Informants, once unthinkable, became the FBI's most powerful weapon. Men who had sworn eternal silence now wore wires for freedom. The most shocking betrayal came in 2002, when Salvatore "Sammy the Bull" Gravano, the underboss of the Gambino family and right-hand man to John Gotti, confessed to 19 murders in exchange for leniency. Gotti, once called the Teflon Don for escaping multiple trials, was finally convicted and died in prison. It was poetic justice, the flamboyant gangster who loved cameras, destroyed by his own fame. But perhaps the most chilling truth was this: even as its leaders were buried or jailed, the Mafia never vanished. It simply evolved into something quieter, more sophisticated. In the 2000s, the FBI uncovered Mafia involvement in Wall Street scams, cybercrime, and international drug routes stretching from Colombia to Eastern Europe. The old rituals, the burning of the saint's image, the blood oaths, became rarer, but the spirit remained. The families still existed, the names still carried weight: Gambino, Genovese, Lucchese, Bonanno, Colombo. Only the battlefield had changed. Today, La Cosa Nostra is no longer the empire it once was, but its ghost lingers everywhere: in politics, in finance, in construction contracts, even in Hollywood's fascination with its myth. The irony is cruel. The very organization built on silence has become one of the most talked about subjects in modern history. Movies, series, books, and documentaries have turned gangsters into cultural icons, transforming men of violence into symbols of rebellion and power. Yet beneath the glamour lies the real story, one of greed, fear, and the unending cycle of betrayal. Even in Sicily, decades after Falcone and Borsellino's deaths, the Mafia's presence is felt like a chill in the air. Its structure may be fractured, its leaders gone, but its influence persists in small towns and local politics, in the subtle exchange of favors and silence. A store owner who pays a fee for protection, a contractor who wins a bid because he knows the right man, a mayor who looks away. The ghost of La Cosa Nostra does not need to kill anymore to control. It simply whispers, and that, perhaps, is its final evolution. From a brotherhood of blood to a network of influence. The modern mafia no longer needs to shoot its enemies. It buys them. It no longer hides in the shadows. It walks among us, disguised as legitimate power. What began in the dusty hills of Sicily as a desperate cry for justice became one of the most powerful criminal systems in the world, and then a warning to history. La Cosa Nostra was never just about crime. It was about control, about what happens when loyalty replaces law, when silence becomes stronger than truth, and when men believe they can build an empire on fear. Today, the guns may be silent, but the legacy remains. Every time power is hidden behind secrecy, every time corruption masquerades as honor, the ghost of La Cosa Nostra is there, watching, waiting, reminding the world that our thing was never just theirs. It belongs to every society that allows silence to speak louder than justice.